Explain like I'm five. I don't understand how a fish can get into a lake. Explain like I'm five. This is an example of a lake called Dayang Bunting Lake in my home country of Malaysia. It's like a lake on an island, surrounded by water. The origin is like a limestone place collapsed and rainfall collected, creating a humongous lake. The surroundings are very high and unlikely to flood over. And there are fish in the lake. How did the fish get in there? With no input of water into the lake. I found the lake you mentioned in Google Earth. A few things come to mind. You specifically mentioned limestone. The location and landscape suggests you're dealing with something called karst topography, created by limestone dissolving. In these settings, bodies of fresh water can be connected by caves. Changes in topography mean that a lake that is isolated today may have been connected to other bodies of water in the past. Even if the surrounding terrain is too high for flooding to cross it, fish and their eggs sometimes get transported by birds. So I raised catfish in the US for a few years. We would completely drain a pond, fill it back up the next year, and sometimes there would be fish in it, shad and catfish especially, but sometimes local river fish, before you put your fry in if you gave it enough time. In the catfish industry, the phenomena is called a natural spawn, and it's attributed to birds transporting eggs from one pond to another. Most natural lakes are connected to other waterways at some point in their history, either when they're initially formed or during freak weather events that lead to flooding. Something like a former quarry that slowly fills with rainwater could either have humans release types of fish they want to eat, an inflow of water during a temporary event, allowing fish to migrate, etc. For the specific lake you mentioned, the most common explanation is that people brought fish to the lake and released them there to catch later. Ducks can eat fish eggs, presumably accidentally while eating water plants, and some of the eggs can survive the digestive tract and be excreted as viable eggs. I've also read in a journal that fish eggs can get attached to duck feet as well and are viable after flights to other lakes, and they fall off. There are lots of ways. 1. If there was a body of water there in the not-too-distant past, and a cycle of flooding and drying is expected, several species of fish will either burrow into the ground or lay eggs in the mud to lay dormant until seasonal flooding. Probably not relevant in your case, but worth pointing out. 2. Birds of prey. Say a predatory bird grabs a fish carrying eggs and accidentally drops it. If it winds up in the lake, those eggs hatch, and now there are fish. Similar but related. Eggs designed to latch on to the feathers of waterfowl like ducks. The feathers fall off when the duck is roosting and bam, now there are eggs in the pond. 3. People bringing them there intentionally. Requires probably the least explanation. This is really interesting. I never knew there were so many ways fish could end up in a lake. It's amazing to think about how different animals and even humans can play a role in bringing fish to a body of water. It makes me wonder how often this happens in other places, and if there are specific types of fish that are more prone to being transported in these ways. It's really cool to learn about the different ways fish can end up in a lake. Have you ever come across a similar situation in your own experiences or in your local area? What do you think is the most common way fish end up in a lake, and how does it affect the ecosystem of the lake? Let me know in the comments down below, and let's move right into our next Reddit post. Explain like I'm five. Why can't we just widen Panama Canal to like a mile wide and normalize all the water levels? This is an incredibly stupid question, but I'd really like to know what the consequences of a project like this would be given the current drought in the lake that feeds the canal. Edit, as many have pointed out, yes, I meant to say, why can't we just dig a sea-level canal all the way through of any arbitrary width needed for shipping? The maximum land elevation of the canal is almost 100 feet above sea level. Excavating an area 50 to 100 feet deep and very wide would be a massively expensive project. There was a proposal in the 1950s to blast a sea-level canal through Nicaragua using atomic bombs. This was part of an Atoms for Peace program. I think it probably wasn't practical and probably wasn't popular with people living in the area. In any case, the project didn't proceed. Similar to the plans to flood the Sahara Desert with the Mediterranean Sea to increase cropland. Sahara Sea proposal. It would be a huge and costly undertaking. Possible, sure. No reason it cannot be done. But we can also build a huge railway system that lifts boats out of the Atlantic or Pacific, hauls them up and over mountains, and deposits them into the Pacific or Atlantic. And we can do this anywhere there is land between two bodies of water. The reason we don't do it is the same reason we don't widen the Panama Canal. The costs involved greatly exceed the benefits. And I'm not sure what you mean by normalize sea levels, but if you mean why can't we remove the locks and connect Atlantic to Pacific without using the lock system, you should know that sea level on either side of the canal is different. It's a difference of only about 20 centimeters on average, but removing the locks would cause the top 20 centimeters of the Pacific Ocean to try to dump into the Atlantic Ocean. Well, not exactly, but you get the idea. The volume and force of water flowing from one ocean to the other would be enormous. The locks, in part, address this issue, and in part literally raise the boats up and over about 26 meters of land. Why is the water level in the Pacific higher than the Atlantic? Don't they both fluctuate depending on the tide on each side? I imagine a lockless and sea level canal would suffer from a one-way current full of coastal waste to the other ocean or sea. Tides might be a problem too. This topic is definitely interesting and thought-provoking. The idea of widening the Panama Canal to accommodate a sea level canal brings up a lot of complex issues and potential consequences. I mean, just think about it. The sheer scale of the project alone would make it an enormous feat. Can you imagine the environmental impact and the potential disruption to the surrounding ecosystems? And then there's the concern about water levels and drought affecting the feasibility of such a massive undertaking. It's definitely a lot to consider, but I can't help but wonder about the technological and engineering challenges that would come with creating a sea level canal of that size. How would it affect global shipping and trade routes? And what kind of impact would it have on the local communities and economies? It's such a big idea with so many potential ripple effects. What are your thoughts on the feasibility and potential implications of creating a sea level canal like this? And how do you think it would impact the surrounding environment and communities? Let me know in the comments down below, and let's move right into our next Reddit post. Explain like I'm 5. Why does air pressure difference make us have airplane ears during a flight if airliners are pressurized? Aircraft aren't pressurized to the same level as sea level. At cruising altitude, there's still a noticeable difference between ground level air pressure and cabin air pressure. 8,000 feet is what it usually is. While airplanes can handle full pressure, it helps reduce stress on the airframe and helps them last a lot longer. Airplanes are pressurized, so the cabin environment is equivalent to no more than 8,000 feet of altitude. That's still 8,000 feet to adjust for your ears. Translated to absolute figures, on the ground level, it's 1 ATM. Up at cruising altitude of around 33,000 feet, it's 0.20.3 ATM outside and 0. 8 ATM inside. The ears have to vent out 20% of air during climb and take in 20% air during descent. If your ears can't adjust quickly enough, pressure builds up on your eardrums and it hurts. Better materials like carbon fiber are used in construction of newer planes, so they can be designed to take more pressure differential. They can be pressurized to the equivalent of maybe 6,000 feet of air pressure inside the cabin. This reduces fatigue for occupants and maybe less stress for your ears. Does this apply to the 787? The better pressurization? I've flown across the Atlantic a few times and it always left me miserable. But the couple of times I did it on a 787, I was remarkably feeling quite well afterwards. Great answers about the 8,000-foot thing. To piggyback on this, on how pressurization works, there seems to have been this idea that we get on a plane, the door shuts, and now it's this perfectly sealed tube where the air is all trapped. Not sure how this came about. Maybe through pop culture/movies. In reality, there are loads of leaks and holes around doors and windows and elsewhere all over the plane. air is constantly leaking out. It's not a big deal. We just use the compressed air from the engines to keep pumping air into the cabin at a higher rate than it's leaving. There's actually a valve that opens and shuts, partially shuts, to constantly regulate how much air is leaving all the time. This pumping usually starts after the first engine is started. The cabin pressure regulator might pressurize 1% higher than the outside on the ground at this time. When the engines are spooled up for takeoff, pressurization really begins, and they might take you to around 1x outside pressure, and that's before the airplane even leaves the ground. Some people's ears might even equalize during takeoff roll because of this, even though your altitude is 0 above the ground. The airplane will then climb at maybe 2,000 to 3,000 feet per minute, but the cabin pressure feels like it is climbing at maybe 500 per minute all the way until the cabin hits around 8,000, at which point it just keeps you there. Hope this helps. Other people have commented about the 8,000-foot pressurization, so I'll ignore that in my comment. Another thing to add is that the cabin pressure can rapidly change when the engines spin up or down. Cabin pressure is maintained by bleeding air from the high-pressure turbines just before combustion. Even if they are targeting 8,000 feet of elevation, this drop or increase in pressure can be felt by your ears. It's also why one of the first signs of a bird strike is the distinct aroma of fried chicken in the cabin. Airliners are not pressurized to the pressure of the airport you take off from or to sea level pressure. The requirement is the pressure should be at least what it is at 8,000 feet, 2,438 meters, which is close to 75% of the pressure at sea level. The reason is the higher the pressure difference between the inside and outside, the higher the force the hull needs to handle. You could build the airplane so it is pressurized to sea level pressure. It is allowed and not hard at all. The problem is it would make the airplane heavier, which means it costs more to operate. Some airplanes are pressurized to a slightly lower altitude, but I do not think any are to sea level. The required pressure is picked, so humans do not get sick from it. The problem with air is one of pressure change, and there are rules of how fast the pressure can drop and increase. This is actually really interesting. I never knew that airplanes are pressurized to only the equivalent of 8,000 feet, and I had no idea about the specific details of how the pressurization system works. It's fascinating to learn about how the pressure inside the cabin is regulated and how it differs from the outside pressure at cruising altitude. And the fact that there are constant leaks and holes around the plane is something I hadn't considered before. It's so cool to think about how the entire system is designed to keep passengers safe and comfortable during a flight. So I have to ask, does this mean that the pressure inside the cabin can still fluctuate even though the airplane is pressurized? And what are the potential risks associated with these pressure fluctuations, if any? Well, that's another episode of Explain Like I'm 5 in the books. I really appreciate all of you who made it this far into the video. Of course, if you enjoyed this video, it would really help the channel out a lot if you gave the video a thumbs up, subscribe, or leave a comment down below. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.